The World We Create, From God to Market, by Tomas Björkman, read by Mark Meadows. Let us turn inward for a moment. Close your eyes and clasp your hands, and stop for a moment to observe how your hands feel. You might notice that the sensations in your hands make up wide inner landscapes of perception. Is there warmth, pressure, smoothness, moisture, a certain pleasure? Can you feel the contrast between the touched and the untouched, between the hand and the fingertips? Then try to answer what it means that you feel something. How do you actually recognize these perceptions? What is feeling in itself, as it so self-evidently appears before your inner horizon? We have now begun to observe our perception. We can go on and investigate the rest of our body, how everything feels within us. Maybe there is something deep down in our stomach that we did not notice before we closed our eyes, some emotional need or issue that needs attention. The more time we spend focusing on our inner landscape, the more emotions and thoughts we can become aware of, and the better we will understand them. As we mature, most of us have probably experienced that we get better at relating to ourselves, that we improve our understanding of ourself, who we are as persons, and thereby come to understand others and the world around us much better. That which previously lay silent in the background, what remained outside the scope of our self-perception when we were younger, can become an object in our awareness that we can relate to. We often refer to such experiences as personal growth, learning experiences that gave us new wisdom, or simply growing up. But sometimes the term psychological development is a better description. When we say we have grown as persons, we often do not mean that we have merely acquired more knowledge, but rather that we have obtained new perspectives and attitudes towards life. This may entail that we have come to see the world and ourselves from a higher perspective, and that our mind has developed to become a more sophisticated piece of machinery. When we turn our gaze inwards and reflect upon our experiences, thoughts, and emotions, we can take these subjective aspects as objects for investigation and thereby alter how they interfere in our lives. This exploration of our inner world has been the bedrock of mysticism, spirituality, and religion for millennia. The creation of institutions to cultivate the human soul's capacity for self-reflection became a highly prioritized societal concern during the Axial Age, not only in order to serve individuals' personal needs and desires, but also as a crucial means to ensure the well-being of society itself. That it is possible, with a more contemporary phrasing, to create support structures to help develop desirable traits in our psyches, that we can increase our consciousness and thereby foster better functioning societies, has been known for thousands of years. Today, however, this insight seems to have been largely forgotten, as our focus has more or less entirely shifted towards the development of aspects in the exterior world. Progress, as the term is commonly used today, mostly revolves around the development of new technologies and societal structures. But to accommodate the changes we make to our exterior world, we need a corresponding development of our interior. If we are to manage the increasing complexity of the world, we need to develop the complexity of our minds as well. In this chapter, I will introduce the idea of the mind as an evolving entity. With the help of the growing research fields in transformative learning and developmental psychology, I wish to show that adult humans can develop their cognitive capacities throughout life, and why it is not only possible that the average level of psychological development can be higher than it is today, but that it is also critical that we achieve this. Transformative learning. There is plentiful empirical support indicating that humans, under favorable conditions, can develop their ability to perceive and interpret increasingly complex phenomena and contexts in fundamentally new ways. But what exactly is meant by this? And what is it that needs to happen in order for this transformative development to materialize? Our inner representation of the world and ourselves, the remarkable, ever-present world map we navigate by, must be experienced as coherent and meaningful if we are to remain psychologically functional and navigate our exterior world successfully. Our mind is a meaning-creating machine that constantly attempts to make sense of what we experience. Our mind's capacity for meaning creation can be developed throughout life, not just in its content, but also in its structure. It is not merely what we know that can be developed, but also how we know. Some thinkers talk of horizontal versus vertical development, which also can be described as in-breadth versus in-depth development. Horizontal development represents what we know and what we can do, the breadth of our knowledge and skills. Vertical development represents how we know, how we arrange our knowledge and experiences, and how we tie these into meaningful and cohesive wholes. This development usually occurs in larger steps, transformations, rather than the piecemeal acquisitions of new bits of knowledge that characterize horizontal development, and is therefore sometimes referred to as transformative learning. The term vertical implies that we develop deeper and higher modes of cognition, the capacity to perceive and make sense of aspects that previously remained out of reach before the transformation, since they were too deep or of too high a complexity. What we know may remain the same, but how we know, how we interpret this knowledge, will have increased in nuance and sophistication. How our consciousness knows also influences how our consciousness experiences. Our experiences of the world, and thereby our emotions vis-à-vis the world, and eventually our actions, are influenced just as much by how our consciousness knows as what we know. The function in our consciousness that knows and experiences is commonly referred to as the subject by philosophers and psychologists. Our subject is that within us that contains our experiences, the objects of our subjective mind. The subject is also what we might call the self. That which we know about or experience is referred to as an object of our consciousness. We cannot experience our subject ourselves, we merely are our subject. If we could experience our subject, as some might claim, it would not be our subject, but an object of our consciousness. What we perceive as objects and what constitutes our self can thus change throughout life. By gaining transformative learning experiences, we can make objects out of what previously remained subject, and thereby change what constitutes the self. In this sense, transformative psychological development is the development of our experiencing subject or ego development. In other words, it is the development of consciousness itself. Philosophers and others long believed that our inner experience of the world was an accurate depiction of an objective external reality. This view is called naive realism by some, that we believe we are experiencing the world as it is. In the Western philosophical tradition, it was Kant who, in 1781, in his work Critique of Pure Reason, first pointed out that it is our consciousness that creates our experience of the world. Kant went as far as to claim that we really cannot know anything about external reality, about things in themselves, the famous Ding an sich. This view is called absolute idealism, that the only source of knowledge we can gain access to is the experience that our consciousness creates, that all we can know about the world is how our subject or self perceives it. Generations of German philosophers following Kant took an interest in how this subject works, how it creates our experiences, and how it creates meaning from these. In Part 1, we briefly talked about Herder, Schiller, Goethe, and Hegel. They all asked the question, is the subject, our apparatus of interpretation, constant, given by nature, or can it evolve? And if so, what is it that makes how we experience evolve? How can we foster such transformative learning? In the German-speaking world during the 19th century, These philosophers began to refer to the process through which our subject, our consciousness, is formed and transformed by our surrounding societal culture and life experiences as Bildung, which means to form or to become. Bildung has often later been used to refer to the ideal of having sufficient knowledge about high culture, literature, music, philosophy, and so on, considered canonical. But initially this term was meant to denote kinds of mental traits that went beyond mere horizontal acquisitions of knowledge. As kings and nobles gradually lost political control in Europe during the 19th century, and the people then had to take over the responsibility of governing themselves, it was believed they needed more than just knowledge about how society works in order to behave as responsible and ethical citizens. They also needed a certain amount of Bildung, sensibilities, values, and ways of thinking that, contrary to formal education, required what we today would call transformative learning experiences. Thus, Bildung, it was claimed, could not be taught in the conventional meaning of the word. It had to be cultivated. To achieve this, it was believed that destabilizing cultural experiences played a vital role to give new perspectives on life and in that way push development forward. The preoccupation with fine art, classical music, and literature was therefore not meant as something to be learned in order to appear cultured or to entertain one's guests at dinner parties, but as a means to expand our horizons and develop consciousness in ways considered to meet the complexity of modern society. These ideas became particularly widespread and influential in the Nordic countries and came to shape how these societies developed during the 20th century. How the idea of lifelong transformative learning, the emphasis on aspects beyond formal skills in the education system, and the ambition to raise consciousness levels and awareness in the general population became salient in the Nordic countries is a topic that I, in collaboration with Lena Andersson, have written about in detail in our book, The Nordic Secret. Psychology was not established as a separate academic discipline of its own prior to the 20th century, so academic thinking regarding consciousness occurred within philosophy instead. What is interesting to note, however, is that what the 18th and 19th century philosophers arrived at concerning the development of the self matches very well with what developmental psychologists have been able to confirm during the last 30 years of research. But, for various reasons, these original insights were later overshadowed by positivism's focus on the objectively measurable that dominated much of 20th century science. It was only at the end of the century that psychological science began to seriously take an interest in how we experience and create meaning. Interestingly, the first modern psychologist who came to look more systematically at psychological development was no clinical psychologist, but a biologist and early systems theorist named Jean Piaget. Our mind as a self-organizing system. That our consciousness in fundamental ways can evolve throughout life can be hard to digest with our present rather static view of the adult mind, Homo economicus. Even if most in the West have now accepted the theory of evolution, and thereby that life and the human being have arisen through the development of self-organizing complex systems, many still feel dizzy at the thought that our individual consciousnesses could also be complex systems under constant development. It is, however, precisely in this way the biologist, systems thinker, and developmental psychologist Piaget, in the middle of the 20th century, started to understand and describe the development of the human mind or consciousness. This view has been further developed by many, among others the Harvard professor in psychology Robert Kegan, who has integrated Piaget's systems thinking with Lev Vygotsky's insights about the supporting significance of our symbolic worlds. Kegan sees Piaget's contribution to developmental psychology as fundamental. Albert Einstein, too, brought attention to Piaget's unique idea about the evolving mind. Einstein got to know Piaget in Zurich, where both of them lived during the First World War, and later came to call Piaget's central insight so simple that only a genius could have thought of it. So what then is this insight? Piaget's great contribution to psychology is fundamentally a systems perspective on our consciousness, seeing our individual consciousness as a complex self-organizing system that constantly absorbs energy and information from the environment to increase its own complexity. This is a view that recently has been confirmed by neuroscience. In what is sometimes called the second wave cognitive science, the metaphor of the brain as our hardware and our mind as the software is abandoned in favor of an understanding of our mind as a self-organizing system where there can be no distinction between hardware and software. All is one co-evolving process, and where before we might have been talking about the possibility of our consciousness evolving, it is becoming more and more clear that it is not that our consciousness is evolving, but rather that this constant interaction with the environment and the resulting adaptation process is the ground of our consciousness. Without this development, there would be no mind. Our mind is this self-organizing developmental process. And as in all self-organizing developmental processes, there are more or less marked phase transitions. Piaget observed already at the middle of the last century that children in clearly delineated stages exchange their entire way of thinking for another mode, and that the lines of reasoning they employed in various cognitive experiments followed a clear pattern that was possible to connect to various ages. He demonstrated with great clarity that most children of a certain age made the same cognitive missteps and advances. His experiments showed, for example, that it is rare for a 5-year-old to understand that juice in a low, wide glass still constitutes the same amount as a tall, narrow glass with the same volume. Not even if the child is watching while juice is poured into it. The child insists that there is more juice in the tall, narrow glass because it simply looks as though there is more. After the age of 7, most children have reached the next stage and thereby internalized the insight that their own sensory perceptions are not the same as reality. The structure in the child's thinking has thus taken a developmental step. The child has learned to treat its own sensory impressions as an object, as something that one can reason around and relate to. We see in Piaget an interplay between the individual organism and its environment, a perspective that is clearly rooted in biological systems thinking. In the study of mice and humans, the same fundamental principles apply. The organism recreates the environment in its mind, but this recreation can, through participation in the same environment, be recreated itself by yet higher functions of cognition. Piaget's model contained 4 stages, but more of them have since been identified and proven by other researchers, most clearly in the mathematical psychologist Michael Common's general theory of development, the model of hierarchical complexity. The self's long journey through life. Who am I, really? Or what am I? The self is something that arises in the encounter between humans, something that we learn to relate to through interaction with others. We reflect ourselves in each other and create narratives and identities from our many interactions in daily life. What constitutes one's self today can come to be an object of one's consciousness tomorrow. The self has, of course, not disappeared. It has instead been reborn on a new, more extensive and more embracing level. This circumstance has elegantly been put into words by Thomas Björkman. Within me I carry my earlier faces, as a tree that has its growth rings. It is the sum of them that is I. The mirror merely sees my latest face. I can feel all of my previous ones. When we are infants, we do not have an apprehension of such a self. We do not know our name, and according to research consensus, we do not even clearly separate ourselves from things in our environment. Things just happen. Hunger happens. Fatigue happens. Discomfort happens. Mum's breast happens if we're lucky. Warm milk happens. Eventually, during our childhood, we learn that I am I, that I have a name, an identity. particular personal qualities, that other people cannot see and hear everything that I see and hear, and, at best, that everything in the world does not revolve around me after all. But the body, the emotions, and the sensory impressions obviously do not disappear. There are only new emergent layers built on top of our previous self. These new layers, like Russian dolls, encase the previous ones. Here I am sitting, organizing my sensory impressions and movements in order to write a book. Yet at every moment something is insisting on emerging. The overgrown baby that I am at some level, with hunger, fatigue, impatience, and maybe other things that are related to inner insecurity and yearnings, hope or despair. New layers of the self enable us to catch a glimpse of the earlier ones instead of merely being them. The self is thus a kind of pattern, a structure that arises in consciousness, and this pattern continues its development through life. This particular aspect of our lifelong maturation is sometimes called ego development. In his book, The Evolving Self, Keegan proposes 6 stages of ego development from the 0th to the 5th order of self. He also maintains that there is a particular dynamic in the development of the self, a logic that explains why the various stages of self-apprehension must arise in a particular order. In a later book, he speaks about 6 orders of consciousness. Keegan's stages, or selves, can, as a suggestion, and without violating the theory, also be termed layers. The word layer, I believe, gives a more illuminating image of this ego development. As new layers of development are formed, the earlier ones remain within us and keep influencing our thinking to some extent. So instead of using the word stage, which brings forth the image of a ladder that we gradually climb while losing contact with the lower steps, seeing this development in terms of the formation of layers better illustrates how we always carry around the earlier ones. This can remind us that our consciousness, from one time to another and in various situations, acts from older as well as newer layers, something that Keegan is careful to point out. The formation of a new layer does not mean that our subject has made its home there. It merely means that we, under favorable conditions, have the possibility of experiencing and acting from the new, more complex possibilities this layer provides. On a bad day, we may interpret things in less complex terms and act from lower layers. Our layers of extended consciousness. My foremost ambition is merely to show that transformative development can occur throughout life, that we should replace our static view of the adult consciousness as a ready-made machine in favor of a dynamic view of consciousness as a process under constant development, and that this development can be facilitated or impeded by the environment. The formation of layers 1 and 2. As infants, we are not conscious of a self, and we are not separated from our perceptions, reflexes, and movements either. In the experiencing core of our consciousness, we merely are. We have not developed any structure in our consciousness from which we can perceive our sensory impressions or emotions. We are completely governed by our instincts and completely dependent on our caregivers. However, we are slowly starting to become aware of a world around us that is detached from ourselves, a world we can start to relate to with an emerging perception of a self. This first layer of a more complex consciousness, which will encase our consciousness's core of direct sensory impressions, emotions, and instincts, begins to form at birth or even earlier, and is often well developed at some point between 2 and 6 years of age. With this layer, an awareness of our bodily functions, emotions, and actions is created. There are structures formed in our consciousness from which we can perceive and form opinions about some of the mental and bodily processes that we previously were completely embedded in, subjective experiences that we once were one with but have now become objects in our consciousness. It is here, for instance, that we can start potty training. Until a child has developed an awareness of its bodily functions, it is meaningless to try potty training. Usually after 6 years of age, a second layer in cognitive complexity will form. With this layer, structures allowing us to see our own sensory perceptions from a mental distance start to develop. This also gives us the possibility to understand that others see the world from other vantage points, that everyone does not have the same sensory impressions as oneself. Thus far, the development is largely determined by our biology. We can assume that most of the early Homo sapiens that we studied in Part 1 developed this second layer. This layer was necessary for our survival on the savannah. We had to be able to distinguish our sensory impressions from reality, for example, during the hunt. We also saw how important it was for our survival to develop an understanding of what is going on in the consciousness of others, a theory of mind to understand neighbors and enemies. However, very few humans today remain over their entire lives within this Stone Age consciousness, where our needs and immediate desires still own us. This level of consciousness, an instrumental mind, is in many ways insufficient for our society today, and if we do not evolve further, there is a considerable risk that we get problems in life, for instance, by ending up in prison. The formation of Layer 3. If things progress smoothly, we will have a well-developed second layer before we enter our teenage years. Most of us develop mental capacities in our teens that enable us to relate to our needs, desires, and wills from a mental distance. What previously remained subject becomes object, and, with that, the ability to manipulate the new object in our consciousness. A few years ago, when I was the leader at one of the Foundation Ekfjöret's youth camps, I heard a conversation between a 15-year-old girl and a youth leader. The girl said she constantly felt stressed and torn between all the things she wanted to do and could do. Meet friends, hang out on social media, do sports, etc. The somewhat older leader said a few wise words that made her stop and think. Evidently, she was mature enough to take a considerable step in her development, for she answered, somewhat surprised by her new insight, "Now I see that I really don't have to do everything I want to do." Thus far, her wishes, desires, and needs had owned her, which had caused her considerable stress. But with this step in her transformative learning, she came to regard her own will as an object for reflection. For the first time, she could liberate herself from her will and thereby gain greater control over her life and increased freedom to act in ways that had previously not been possible for her. With the formation of the third layer during our youth, we also begin to see the significance of being part of a larger group. Not merely as a means for personal gain, but because we seek shared values and want to be part of a greater togetherness. What others think of us also becomes more important. Our sense of self-worth becomes dependent on what others think. We want to fit in, and we internalize our surrounding society's culture and values. When this layer is fully developed, we become part of our culture and society, and we are expected to have the ability to control our immediate inclinations. We adhere to laws and social conventions, not just because we want to avoid punishment, but because it feels right to follow our group's norms and values. This process, where we internalize our environment's culture and values, is sometimes referred to as socialization. Accordingly, Keegan calls this layer the socialized mind. That we have formed this third layer of consciousness, however, does not mean that we always act from this more complex layer of thinking. If we become stressed or fearful, we will often act from earlier layers or even from our instinctive core. This has obvious evolutionary roots. Those of our ancestors on the savannah who stopped and started to reflect upon their emotions and will when attacked by a lion probably did not survive. When exposed to dangers, it is usually better to just react from lower-level instincts than from the time-consuming reflections on our immediate will. The problem, however, is that the same pattern of reactions governs us even today when we, for example in our work, feel challenged or worried. and therefore cannot bring ourselves to act from our highest layer of consciousness. Scared and stressed humans rarely behave in accordance with their highest potential. The third layer's socialized self turns our desires and needs into an object for our consciousness, while the mutual relations and agreements in everyday life become subjects. I am a responsible parent, a wise teacher, a party animal, and so on. One's needs are then shaped around these roles. I want to have a safe Volvo car because I am a responsible parent, a Porsche because I'm a playboy. We shape our relations and personality to accommodate society's expectations, attempt to fit into the role our culture has given us, and act accordingly. Usually we do so rather unconsciously. We are aware of what is expected from us, but rarely ponder why that is and why we want to fit in. In this layer of consciousness, our values and norms, our ideology, or our religion function as the filter through which we view and relate to the world. We have acquired these from our culture, our friends, or our family, and they have become an integrated part of who we consider ourselves to be. These filters own us, we do not own them. They are templates through which we create meaning and understand the world. But if these are challenged, we cannot reflexively relate to what is happening and may become confused or even feel violated. Critical reflection on social norms is a cognitive capacity that requires yet another layer of psychological complexity. The formation of Layer 4. Many, but not all, less than half of the population in the West, according to some research, develop a fourth layer later in life. If this occurs, it is often in the middle of life, in connection with some kind of crisis or other major disruption. We might then start questioning our life ambitions and values. We may ask ourselves whether our life objectives and values really are our own, or if they may be those of our parents, our colleagues, or quite simply what our culture expects of us. In exceptional cases, it occurs as early as during our late teens, but then the right form of support and challenges are often required from our environment. With the formation of the fourth layer, we start questioning society's norms and become less dependent on what others think of us. With our own reason and logical thinking, we begin to find our own inner compass. In a traditional society, this can be expressed by questioning religion. We may find that our religion or culture does not represent what we deep down stand for. We may become engaged in the rights of homosexuals and gender equality and summon the courage to question moral strictures that we find outmoded, even if this would entail being stigmatized. In a more secular society, we may question what are considered the accepted truths, e.g., political correctness, scientific authority, etc. We challenge social boundaries that we cannot venture outside without running the risk of being called into question by our society. We may become righteous rebels. We also gain the ability to relate more freely and openly to our values. We can take our own values as objects of reflection and may not feel as threatened if someone challenges them. We are not, as previously, completely identified with them. Our values no longer own us. Instead, we acquire the ability to own them and reflect upon them as something outside of ourselves. Layer 4 thus revolves around being able to perceive social norms, ideologies, religions, morals, and other abstractions as objects that we can actively choose among. Through these choices, we become authors of our own selves for the first time. We become self-authoring, in Keegan's words. Nonetheless, we cannot yet perceive our own need for autonomy, our own emancipation process or personal self-realization project as an object, since we are too heavily embedded in this. Bildungsroman is a term that is sometimes used for novels about a person's maturing from being unconsciously embedded in their culture and context to becoming able to liberate themselves from these confines and take their environment's values, expectations, and requirements as objects of independent reflection. Good examples of such novels about personal transformation are Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre and Faust. A more contemporary example is J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Even though a large share of the population in the West at some point in their lives initiate the formation of Layer 4, there are studies indicating that less than half of all adults have the ability to act consistently from this stage of cognition. The following layer is even rarer. The formation of Layer 5. A small part of the population experiences the formation of a fifth layer later in life, often after the age of 50, according to Keegan. Here we begin taking our own autonomy as an object of reflection and develop what Keegan calls a self-transforming mind. We are no longer as dependent on maintaining our individuality and sticking stubbornly to our own inner compass. Increasingly, we orient ourselves towards the group and society, though this time not as a socialized part of our culture, but with a playful questioning of our individuality and society's norms. If the self-evident objective had previously been to find ourselves and build our identity and our self, we can now enable ourselves to make this process an object of reflection and thereby start letting go of the identification with our own self-realization project. Hence, we can begin to surpass, transcend ourself. This enables us to much more freely choose our perspective on ourselves and our environment. We can relate more openly to several perspectives that we, earlier, in our quest for authenticity, might have considered contradictory and irreconcilable. Paradoxes become something that we can appreciate and learn from, not necessarily something to avoid or try to dissolve. Reasoning with formal logic is thus complemented with what can be termed dialectical logic. It is no longer a question of either or both and, but of both either or and both and at once. Now we can choose whether we want to be autonomous or not, and we can become better at relating to our thoughts and behavioral patterns, emotional hang-ups, and passions and frustrations as objects. We also develop an ability to see how events and relations influence our emotions, and how we respond to these in turn influences events and relations in a constant interplay without beginning or end. This interplay between ourselves, our emotions, our autonomy, our cultural context, how we choose to act from this, the environment's reactions to our actions, and how these in turn influence us, becomes something we can take as an object of reflection. When the fifth layer has been formed, the self assumes increasingly abstract, detached, and more universally applicable forms. We see that our self-perception is not directly tied to ourselves as bodies and persons. Instead, social contexts and creation processes, including other people's completely different perspectives and levels of psychological development, become subsumed into what we identify with the most. Even our values are now regarded as something that are under constant reconstruction and development. The inner convictions that the previous layer frenetically defends as its most sacred treasures now instead become something to tinker with, replace, and further develop. Once again, however, I need to point out that the previous layers remain within us. They can be activated and may become governing if we are threatened or put under considerable stress. If we risk losing our sense of who we are, we may revert to thinking and acting in accordance with Layer 2. Moreover, we can, on good or bad days, shift between the various layers. A heavy migraine or a caustic divorce can make it harder to see oneself as part of a dancing interplay with the environment. But on a carefree morning when we are working with the project of our dreams, it is easier to embrace a more abstract self-conception. It is a very small part of the population, studies indicate it may be around 1%, that consistently acts from the fifth layer. This may not sound a lot, but 1% does, after all, represent many millions of people worldwide. However, the problem is that these people are often not in contact with each other and often feel isolated and poorly understood by their society. Our culture assumes that we all function in accordance with the earlier layers, So whenever someone makes arguments derived from the fifth layer of complexity, their thoughts are often misunderstood or ignored, with the sad consequence that society fails to learn from the useful wisdoms of these people. The following sums up how we, through the formation of new layers of cognitive complexity, can take new parts of our self, our subject, as an object of reflection, and how they relate to the complexity levels described in the previous chapter. In the rest of this chapter and the following, I will refer to these layers simply as Keegan 0 to 5. What then is the pattern that unites these developmental layers or phases of transformative learning? In fact, I've mentioned it already, an object-subject dynamic. Every new layer makes the previous one an object, something that we can relate to and manipulate from a previously unobtained distance. This developmental dynamic has been observed by many of psychology's most notable thinkers and has been given many different names. George H. Mead argued that the self consisted of an I and a me, where I corresponds to the subject and me corresponds to the object. Freud's motto, "Where id was, there ego shall be," speaks the same language. C.G. Jung talked about incorporating various parts of the unconscious, the so-called shadow, which can also be seen as a sort of developmental process making previous subjects into objects. The developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, who claimed that individuals can develop ethically throughout life, equally argued that the later phases in life were built on the development of earlier ones. While one can hardly equate these theories with each other, they address the same overall issue, that the self can incorporate new parts of itself and thereby transform itself into a higher functioning subject, a more conscious individual. The different aspects of our ego development. Every new layer creates some kind of structural reorganization of our consciousness that comprises many different aspects of how we perceive and relate to ourselves and the world. This entails, for instance, that we can participate in and relate to more complex relations. Our meaning creation and our interpretation of the world become more nuanced and sophisticated. We can assume more perspectives on a formulated problem. We become increasingly adept at understanding others' thoughts and emotions. We gain an increased ability to include more sentient beings in our circle of empathy. Our way of reasoning around moral dilemmas thereby becomes more consistent and universal. And what we value most in life changes to accommodate these new insights, and thereby increases the likelihood of our behavior being more prudent, reasonable, and considerate. With every layer, we thus become more complex thinkers, capable of grasping more perspectives and aspects of the world, and arguably even somewhat better behaving, as claimed by Erik Erikson. All of these are necessary to manage an increasingly complex society and the many different, often contradicting perspectives of its inhabitants. However, that we can develop ethically is perhaps the most important point. That transformative learning can increase our ethical reasoning, that more developed individuals may behave more ethically, and that they can be more empathic, is perhaps the most contested issue within the field of psychological development. But given that psychological development can basically be summed up as an increase in our awareness, this ought to include ethical aspects as well. For instance, when we become aware of aspects of our mind that once remained hidden to ourselves, it is reasonable to claim that that should improve our understanding of others' perspectives that once were similar to our own. This arguably increases the likelihood of becoming more empathic towards them, which thereby helps develop our ethical reasoning. The idea that psychological development goes hand in hand with ethical development is therefore not as far-fetched as it may sound to begin with. It does not, however, mean that highly developed individuals always behave more ethically, that a person who acts stably on Keegan 5 cannot be a scoundrel and a delinquent, or that a less developed person cannot behave more ethically than a more developed one. But the scope of one's capacity to see the perspective of others, the level of sophistication and consistency in one's ethical reasoning, and thereby the odds of behaving accordingly may arguably be higher in a more mature individual than a less mature one. However, ethics, or empathy, or compassion is just one aspect that can be developed throughout life. According to Thomas Jordan, there are 5 others: complexity awareness, contextual awareness, relational awareness, self-insight, and perspectival awareness. Compassion, empathy. Empathy entails compassion for and understanding of other humans. Empathy can only be developed once we have separated ourselves from the world and realize that other people have their own experiences, i.e., when we have left the egocentric perspective of the child. Through socialization processes, we develop the capacity to feel with others that belong to our closest circle. But this is not to say that empathy is fully developed at this stage. Empathy can be developed throughout our lives, deepened and extended to encompass more people, even those who are strangers. The extension of our empathy is then not limited by group belonging. The greater the togetherness we feel, the greater a part of the world can be included into our circle of solidarity. All of humanity, and sometimes even all sentient beings, can come to be contained in our capacity for empathy. We also become more involved in and touched by world events at further distances from ourselves. The capacity for empathy requires that we set ourselves aside and develop insights and emotional involvement about others' inner states. With empathy, we bridge the distance to other subjects. Instead of seeing them as objects, they become subjects, as a benign reversal of the subject-to-object development of equal consideration to ourselves. It should be added that real empathy consists of both emotional engagement and cognitive understanding. If only the latter is present, as in psychopaths, it does not constitute what is here meant by empathy. If the opposite is the case, the experienced compassion can be seen as a kind of empathy, but a severely handicapped kind that inhibits the person's ethical reasoning in general, and one that largely relies on the intensity of the feelings of compassion, which can vary from moment to moment, and thereby results in less reasonable behavior. A well-developed sense of empathy can generate deep-felt emotions of compassion towards others and an accurate understanding of what they feel and why. The capacity to feel compassion towards others and understand their perspectives obviously has great significance in a society, and since ever-increasing complexity has made our mutual welfare and survival reliant on the cooperation between billions of people both within and across national borders, with more diverse and vastly different perspectives than ever before, the demands for our empathic capacity to include more individuals into our sphere of solidarity and understand alien perspectives have never been greater. In our hyper-complex global society, it does not suffice to merely feel compassion with those in our closest proximity, or to only understand the perspectives of people with whom we share the same culture. In order to manage an increasingly complex world, we need to ensure that more people develop the empathic capacities required of a truly global citizen. Complexity awareness. Complexity awareness is the capacity to make analytically sound inferences. A higher complexity awareness can manage more variables simultaneously, make more inferences from these, and better coordinate these into systems, systems within systems, and so forth. The kind of cognitive complexity we are talking about here is sometimes referred to as vertical complexity. Horizontal complexity is that of intelligence, or IQ, which merely determines the speed of our analytic thinking. Vertical complexity, on the other hand, is about how our analytic thinking works. Complexity awareness revolves around expecting that there are circumstances, underlying causal connections, and system properties which might be relevant to see and understand in order to carry out a task successfully. A low degree of complexity awareness entails that one does not reflect as much upon more abstractedly perceived possible causes and consequences, but rather takes a stand and acts based on what is tangibly evident. A high degree of complexity awareness generally leads to a more investigating and reflecting approach, where one is well aware that there probably exists a host of relevant circumstances, causal contexts, and possible consequences that one remains ignorant of. To grasp and handle the world's complexity, we need to develop a corresponding cognitive complexity. Managing the increasing complexity of our society obviously requires that we obtain more knowledge and specialize in highly advanced occupations. But knowledge and skills are not the same as cognitive complexity. Performing highly complex tasks requires a corresponding degree of cognitive complexity, but cognitive complexity in itself is not something one can be taught. In my own personal experience, I have known people who all of a sudden started to perform tasks on higher levels of complexity than earlier in their lives. In these cases, new challenges and changes in their environment seemed to function as a kind of scaffolding from which they obtained the necessary means to support their cognitive development towards higher complexity awareness. They may have had some kind of innate ability to think more complexly, but it seems to have been external factors that made them achieve this level of thought. Thus, people may come to think more complexly under the right conditions. We do not know exactly what is required, but since the ever-increasing complexity of the world demands that more of us think more complexly more often, it is paramount that we figure out how we can support this. In the industrial age, it sufficed to think in terms of formal logic and linear causality to make the machines and bureaucracies of modern society work. But in our current chaotic and hyper-complex globalized information society, a civilization on the brink of an ecological disaster, we need more people with highly complex analytic abilities, such as thinking in terms of chaos theory, self-organizing systems, multi-perspectivity, and developmental non-linear logic. Contextual awareness. Contextual awareness is the ability to survey the wider context that tasks and events are situated within. The kinds of properties that prevail in a wider context, the processes of change going on there, what the interactions look like, i.e., how actions might possibly influence the wider context, and how the context in turn influences these. The more contexts we become aware of, and the better we understand them in depth, the more likely we are to develop a sense of responsibility for the greater whole, since we then better realize how it is all connected. Improving our capacity for contextual awareness can also complement our complexity awareness by increasing our understanding of the wider contexts in which complex matters are situated. In a wider context, there is, of course, society or culture. We can therefore also speak of a greater societal consciousness. Being able to see our societal and cultural contexts as objects for reflection also means that we can treat them as the kinds of social imaginaries they are. A higher contextual awareness can thereby make us see the social constructions that previously remained part of our subject from an outside perspective, so that we better manage to analyze and alter them. This also gives us the opportunity to distance and liberate ourselves from the societal and cultural contexts we were once embedded within. Our hyper-complex human civilization requires that we increase our awareness and understanding of the many subtle and to ourselves often culturally alien contexts that have come to play a greater role in our lives. In the industrial age, it was sufficient to know the contexts of society's primary productive and political relations and one's national culture. Today, however, we need to understand a high number of less tangible societal contexts, such as gender norms, identity creation processes, social dynamics, etc., as well as a host of foreign cultures and religions. Even ecological and technological contexts must be considered if we want to get a remotely accurate map of the current world, and if we want to navigate it successfully. Relational awareness. This aspect revolves around the awareness of other people, groups, and social matters that exist in relation to one another, ourselves, and other people. Our relational awareness can help us figure out who others are, what their interests and intentions might be, how they reason and why they act the way they do, how they experience encounters with ourselves, see the situation, and what they might expect from us. Our relational awareness is intimately connected with our empathic capacity to see the perspectives of others. It largely depends on this capacity, but relational awareness is different in the way it determines how well we interpret the information provided by our empathic capacity and how we strategize about social relations. Another word for relational awareness is social intelligence. And like the previous aspects, this can also be more or less developed. A low level of relational awareness makes it hard to manage high numbers of social relations, understand the roles of others, and determine what others want and think about us. People who have a low level of relational awareness often cannot differentiate their own role in a group from that of others. They often fail to see that a social relation does not necessarily mean the same to others as it does to themselves, that people can experience the same relationship differently, and that people might want different things from the relation. As a result, low relational awareness often leads to mismanaged relationships, misunderstandings, and anger and bitterness. A high degree of relational awareness makes it possible to perceive our own perspective on social relations and role within them from a distance. Once again, by making what previously remained subject an object for our consciousness, it becomes possible to investigate it and thereby make better choices. If we more clearly see our role within a relation, how it differs from others, and what is expected from this kind of role, the chances of improving our relations with others will increase. And if we understand how others think and see us, we get a more accurate image of the social dynamics we are situated within, which can help us change how we are perceived and thereby improve our relations and status within the group. This not only serves our own interests, but can also benefit the group. A high level of relational awareness can make us better at figuring out ways to merge the interests of different persons and how to cooperate with others. It is hardly necessary to mention that relational awareness is very important and that high levels of this aspect can make societies better functioning. A well-developed relational awareness is more important than ever, since a growing number of occupations require that people are good at cooperating and managing complex social relations. Improving people's social intelligence should therefore be just as important in our educational system as learning more formal skills. The increasing complexity of our ever more well-connected society requires that we become just as competent at analyzing people and relations as we are at analyzing symbols. Self-insight. Self-insight is the awareness of how our self functions on a psychological level. This entails the ability to feel and understand what is happening within ourselves, what we feel and think and why, thus understanding why we behave the way we do. We can thereby better evaluate what we need to be happy, what we need to avoid, and what we should do to make our behavior more beneficial to ourselves and others. By making our desires, feelings, and thoughts an object for investigation, rather than merely being our desires, feelings, and thoughts, subject becoming object once again, it becomes easier to change ourselves and approach life in a more appropriate manner. The more aspects of our psyche we become aware of, the deeper we venture into the dark corners of our own mind, the more emotional and psychological issues we can resolve, and thereby we obtain more opportunities in life. Developing our capacity for self-insight can give us more freedom, literally speaking, freedom from things that torment our soul, freedom to do things we did not know we were capable of. Developing our empathic capacities, ability to handle high complexity, awareness of contexts, and understanding of social relations is unlikely to occur if we do not simultaneously improve our self-insight. If we do not understand ourselves, we cannot understand the world. Perspectival awareness. From greater self-insight, we gain an improved capacity to see our own perspective from a distance, which thereby increases our perspectival awareness accordingly, which then expands our capacity to see others' perspectives. Perspectival awareness is the capacity to understand that others have different perspectives than oneself, why the same phenomenon can be viewed in different ways, and how our own perspective is just one among many, and therefore not necessarily the most correct one. The more aspects of our own perspective we become aware of, the better we understand why we view the world the way we do, and the better we can become at understanding the perspectives of others. With a high level of perspectival awareness, we can even hold several contradictory perspectives in our mind simultaneously, and thereby develop the sophistication, diverseness, and scope of our general perspective on the world. To make our personal perspective an object for our consciousness to investigate is perhaps the most difficult cognitive task we can perform. And no matter how aware we become of certain aspects of our perspective, we will always remain subjects who see the world from a certain vantage point that we do not notice. Yet, if we take the time to scrutinize our mind and how it sees the world, it becomes possible to make objects out of what currently constitutes our subject. Philosophy, meditation techniques, and time spent contemplating existence can help us get there. If we succeed, our view of the world can become richer, more nuanced, and encompass more of the universe, literally speaking. Those who have obtained more perspectives when they die will have contained more aspects of the universe within their mind. As with all of these psychological aspects, the development of our capacity for perspectival awareness is important if we are to cope with an increasingly complex world. The society we live in already contains a higher number of different perspectives than we currently are able to handle. This is not going to be lower in the future. Our world is a multi-perspectival universe consisting of billions of humans with varying degrees of psychological development in all of the aspects that have been mentioned here. To navigate this world, we therefore need to develop our capacity to understand these perspectives, all while keeping in mind that our own may be inadequate and erroneous, in need of further development. If we do so, we might develop in ways we had not foreseen. Transformative skills. We can use these different aspects of ego development to find a more intuitive way to approach and describe this whole field of inner development. We can see each of these developmental dimensions as describing fundamental aspects of our personality that can be developed as skills. We could then be talking about our lifelong need to develop our capacity for compassion, complex sense-making, perspective-taking, self-knowledge, etc. We could then again use the language of transformative learning that we started this chapter with. These capacities or skills that cannot be developed through traditional education but require the deeper psychological development of transformative learning could then be called transformative skills. Arguing for the need to develop transformative skills is probably easier in today's world than speaking about the more abstract need for ego development. Developing our cognitive complexity is not virtuous in and of itself, but since the complexity of the world around us continues to increase, we risk ending up with the majority of the adult population being out-complexed by their surroundings if they do not obtain the transformative learning experiences required to develop the higher layers of cognition. A society without the necessary support structures to further the personal growth of its inhabitants is destined to have an average level of psychological development that does not correspond with the complexity of the world. If too few of us understand and can competently manage current complexity, any collective efforts to solve the many issues it brings forth will be doomed to fail and eventually lead to disaster. It is therefore a moral imperative that we make the effort to ensure that as many as possible get the opportunity to develop their cognition. How can we support psychological development? We have evolved from a society where most of us functioned in accordance with Keegan 2, driven by our immediate instincts and desires with little means to control them. Through a society where the great moral religions provided us with the necessary symbol tools to help us curb our will so that the majority of us began acting from Keegan 3, to a modern society with widely available education where many of us are able to critically scrutinize our inherited norms and values in accordance with Keegan 4. Developing our society further so that more of us reach Keegan 5 should therefore not only be considered possible. Given the aforementioned capacities of this layer and the way in which they can address the current crises of our increasingly complex world, it is also a moral imperative. A greater share of the population who sees and truly understands the manifold perspectives of others, who derive knowledge and wisdom from the seemingly paradoxical nature of the world, and who do not identify with their autonomous self and put their private project of self-realization at the center of existence, is urgently needed. In order for transformative learning experiences to take place and foster increased psychological development, the individual needs both a certain level of perceived security, materially as well as emotionally, and exposure to reasonably demanding challenges. We need a solid foundation of security to start from, so that we do not regress to earlier and more primitive reaction patterns and defensive survival mechanisms. But we also need a fair number of life challenges that we feel we can overcome, so that we are spurred to move forward and develop novel cognitive tools to tackle the new problems we encounter. Growing up in a loving family and with good schooling can provide us with the sense of security we need in order to develop beyond the most basic layers of cognition. And as we venture into adult life with all the obligations and challenges that entails, the environments we become part of in our studies, work life, and other social contexts can serve as more or less favorable support structures for our personal development. If we feel secure and confident within these while we are simultaneously exposed to stimulating challenges, we become more likely to experience a healthy and prolonged development. Besides obtaining new knowledge, education or similar learning experiences can make us more independent, more responsible, and better at handling more complex issues. If we are lucky to get a job that encourages us to think for ourselves and maybe even provides us opportunities to learn new things, we may not only acquire new technical skills, but grow as persons as well. If our work only consists of repetitive tasks, if we feel that it does not allow us to reach our highest potential, and if we feel disconnected from what we are doing and do not have any influence on our work situation, it may hinder our development. Yet, good opportunities are not the only thing to spur psychological development. Challenges also play a critical role, even if we initially may feel overburdened by them. Sometimes it is the hardest challenges in life that make us grow the most, but only if we make it to the other side without breaking apart. Elfhag has described how various difficulties and crises can compel us to reorient ourselves and our perspective throughout life. Within the field of transformative learning, there has also been much research describing how confrontations with seemingly unsolvable paradoxes and exposure to disconcerting perspectives can function as catalysts for our transformation. Throughout our life journey, we are often put through great stress and severe crises, pain and hurtful emotions that may challenge our very existence and view of ourselves. Growing up and suddenly having to take responsibility for ourselves, heartbreak and sorrow, disease, loss of loved ones, aging, and so on. Such experiences may paralyze us or make us regress to a survivalist mode of living, but they can also serve as learning experiences that provide us with a wider perspective on the world and ourselves. Successful transformation through such crises is more likely to occur if we have access to support structures that help us make sense of our experiences. Loving family members, a loyal lover or spouse, or trusted friends who understand us can help us through such difficulties. Sometimes even professional guidance can function as a support structure to facilitate a personal transformation through a crisis. Culture, not least literature, can also play an important role here. It can provide us with a language to articulate what we feel by providing us access to others' experiences that we can use to mirror our own in order to obtain greater clarity and present us with inspiring narratives to guide us through life's many difficulties and challenges. A culture richly endowed with wisdom traditions and artistic expressions that address the difficult and upsetting things in life is consequently more likely to produce individuals who overcome crises and turn them into valuable learning experiences. Culture and society as a whole can thus play an important role in promoting our development. Generally, affluent societies tend to generate higher levels of psychological development than poorer ones. This partly has to do with higher social security, better education, and more stimulating work opportunities. But these may not be the only factors. Even though psychological development is a relatively new field and much still remains in uncharted territory, there has been research indicating how we might facilitate increased transformative learning on the societal level. We know that people who have had access to therapy and other kinds of professional help have been more likely to turn periods of personal crisis into transformative learning experiences. Accordingly, ensuring that such services are available to everyone who needs them ought to be highly prioritized. And there is plentiful evidence showing that various contemplation techniques, meditation and subtle body exercises, yoga or Tai Chi for example, besides higher well-being, can contribute to increased self-control, inner self-awareness and empathy. As such, these ancient and well-tested methods remain some of the most efficient ways to increase our psychological development. If they became more widely available and were politically encouraged, for instance by making meditation and body exercises part of our schools and workplaces' daily activities, it could lead to some of the most far-reaching positive developments for our society and culture. These are just a few examples of things we know are capable of promoting our psychological development. How exactly they can generate transformative learning and how we best make use of them remain open for further research. But we do know that we can support the development of the human mind. It would therefore be foolish not to make it a societal concern. Learning about the many new insights that a growing number of researchers within the field of psychological development have brought forth, and making transformative learning a highly prioritized societal concern, may very well provide the solutions we need for the countless issues we currently appear hopelessly incapable of handling with our existing thought tools, if for no other reason than because there do not appear to be any better alternatives. If not psychological development, then what is the missing piece to the puzzle? What else could there be that we have not tested yet? I am open for suggestions, but until a more convincing alternative becomes apparent, I will continue to claim that psychological development remains the most promising solution.